in early 2016.
Then, Doctor, in paragraph 33, your conclusions, please.
You'll see there I said there's compelling evidence that Henri van Breda had a generalized tonic-clonic, there was an epileptic seizure on the night after the murder of his parents and brother. When I say compelling evidence, another way of putting that in sort of evidence-based medicine terms is there's a high probability.
Yes.
So you want to run through the
based
on those conclusions. So these span a number of paragraphs, as you'll see. So the first and obvious point to make is that he has a proven diagnosis of epilepsy, proven in terms of the history and unambiguous evidence from the EEGs, as we've shown earlier. This is a little bit like doing someone presenting with weakness on one side of the body and having paralysis, and you do an MRI scan and it confirms a bleed or a brain tumor or whatever.
We just pause there for a moment. Could I just ask you to briefly comment perhaps on a person's ability to, for example, fake a spike on the EEG? We've seen on the clip that was played, Mr. Van Breda with the left thumb that slightly twitching that.
Yeah.
If the purpose of my question, I'll ask you the following. If I were to lie there and I want to attempt to fool you, and I deliberately just twitch my thumb, or twitch my arm, would the EEG result be the same as what we've seen in the EEG that you had in there?
No, emphatic no. And firstly, you would probably push the button afterwards to tell the nurse that you faked it and to draw attention to your symptom. And secondly, that EEG abnormality is like having a tumor on your MRI scan.
You either have it or you don't.
You either have it or you don't. You can't produce that, fake it or malinger it, fabricate it.
So if I were to ask you this question, the accused's ability to fake the symptoms of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. I'm asking specifically because, amongst others, I've been accused of somehow orchestrating my client's epilepsy on social media. I'm going to ask you outright again, I need your emphatic answer as an expert in record. Is it possible?
No, the answer is no.
All right. Then we continue paragraph 35. You say he has had 2 generalized tonic-clonic grand mal seizures since the family murder 21 months apart. And you say many patients with JE has infrequent generalized tonic-clonic seizures. You're obviously referring to the ones he had subsequent to that evening.
Correct.
You may continue.
So with
could events such as these that occur that might precipitate a epileptic attack?
Yeah, that's a good question actually. So sometimes you can have a sequence, a cluster of them, and it precedes a big one immediately afterwards. So some patients can get recurrent ones, and a few seconds later can get a major seizure.
So it means if they never had epilepsy before, they had epileptic attack the night of the murders and then twice over 21 months.
No.
So it's a possible sequence.
So he had, if we exclude the night of the murder, he since then has had 2 generalized tonic-clonic seizures or grand mal seizures. One in February 2016 and one which resulted in him coming to see me.
Those would be unrelated to the murders?
Those would be unrelated to the murders, yeah.
Mr. Wood?
If I could just add on to that question, more importantly, would that be the only seizures on what you've seen and heard from God that he's experienced as a result of him having JME?
No, I think as we will deal with in the next paragraph, which is 36,
yes,
is that it's very clear that he has myoclonus. We've proven that electrophysiologically and with simultaneous video. So that he has myoclonus and that he has juvenile myoclonus is incontrovertible.
Yes. And then in paragraph 36, you actually deal with these myoclonus.
Yes.
Yeah, and just take us through that, please.
So the issue is that, as is very common in juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, the myoclonus, or the first of his symptoms, might be the myoclonus. So in going back in the history, in terms of when things started, in other words, when his epilepsy started, we have the benefit, in this case, of a history of myoclonus at the time when he was completely unaware of its significance in respect of this particular case in court or of his condition. So, and given that, his history that the myoclonus started in the early part of 2015 has been, as I put it in the report, this timing and the presence of the myoclonus has not been cherry-picked by him. Right? The history was obtained from him spontaneously and with him being oblivious to the significance of the myoclonus in terms of his diagnosis and in respect of what transpired on that night. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Good.
You say, in the continuing paragraph 36, you say, during the first consultation with you on 10 November in 17, if you just continue on from there onwards, please.
Yeah, so and just to reiterate, I had sequentially asked him about a long list of symptoms, all of which he had emphatically denied, except one, which was the myoclonus. So, if you're saying that the symptom is fabricated or malingered or whatever, by chance, he happens to have picked one out of all of these symptoms, right? And then he's picked it not knowing that it's in any way related to his condition, which is juvenile myoclonic epilepsy.
And could you also just perhaps also, if I understand paragraph 36 correctly, you seem to stress the point that the one symptom that he chose out of the list of symptoms it just happened to be the one that is consistent with a generalized seizure as opposed to a focal.
So the point about the myoclonus is it's the one symptom out of this long list of symptoms that he happens to have picked and which corresponds to a seizure type which occurs in the minority of instances. In other words, the generalized are less frequent than the focal seizures. And he's also picked the symptom, which happens to coincide perfectly with what's on the EEG in terms of generalized spikes and also what we found subsequently.
I follow.
And at that point, in giving that history, he was, just to reiterate, oblivious to its significance.
Follow.
And to put it another way, had he known about this, he would have presented with a symptom far earlier.
Then paragraph 36.1, just continue there, please.
So given that, and given what I've just said, the myoclonus is therefore highly unlikely to be a false positive or coincidentally correct symptom, as this was the only one in this long list of symptoms that I presented to that he reported to be present. The symptom is perfectly congruent with the intellectual findings, and just to stress again, a myoclonic jerk with a discharge on the EEG is a seizure. It's a myoclonic seizure, and it's categorized as such in the International Classification System. The EEG correlate is a generalized discharge, as one would expect. It's perfectly congruent, and it's a minor point, but in terms of the presence and the dating of it, it's congruent with his girlfriend's observations that she'd noticed this when she first met him in February 2016.
I follow.
And she'd obviously noticed them and had asked him, "Are you all right?" afterwards. So there was some significance to that. It didn't just pass her by and sort of she'd kind of fobbed off as absolutely nothing. She'd noticed it. And then, as is common with people with myoclonus is the longer they think about it, then they realize they nearly dropped something, or the one's holding a cup and they spilt a bit of coffee or whatever.
Yes.
Obviously, that's subject to some sort of recall bias, but nevertheless, many patients, when they think back on it, that's how they remember their myoclonus.
Then in paragraph 36.2, page 11, you make the point that the accused, like many or most patients with a minor seizure, had difficulty in recognizing the exact date of onset.
Yes.
Is that a common occurrence?
That's extremely common. So I saw someone a couple of days ago, again, a very similar story, myoclonus for a couple of years, and only very recently diagnosed with juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. He had no idea of the significance, or so it's not he, she, had no idea of the significance of these. And so the diagnosis is only made now when she presents with the major seizures. The condition has been there for a few years. And that's very common. And it's also not just common in the generalized epilepsies, but also in the focal epilepsies. So people will have episodes of, I saw someone recently recently diagnosed with epilepsy, who since the mid-2000s has had a combination of stereotyped brief episodes, just to make the point, of some nausea, episodic nausea associated with déjà vu, right? And that's gone on for more than a decade until the diagnosis of epilepsy is made, when someone has a more major seizure and they go and see, well, this instance came to see me. I saw someone, just to reiterate the point, the anecdote, on Saturday, someone who for 8 years has had very brief dizzy episodes, in last year she has the first major seizure. She has an EEG, she has a 24-hour EEG that's normal, and she has an MRI scan that's normal, and she is told by the neurologist that it's the first seizure she's ever had. And when you look back in the history, she's clearly had epilepsy for 8 years prior to that, with these brief dizzy episodes, which simply represent little seizures, focal seizures in one part of the brain. They last a matter of seconds, 20 or 30 seconds, and those are little focal seizures. So
the dizzy spells would be related to
focal seizures, yeah, unquestionably.
Okay. Then paragraph 36.3, you marked as follows: in summary, as should be clear from the above carefully orchestrated sequence of history taking, the EEG review and the late disclosure of findings and conclusions to avoid false positive findings and false conclusions, his history of myoclonus is robustly reliable. Yes,
I agree with, that's exactly correct. I'd probably take out, I was looking at reading this last night and thought to myself, robustly reliable is tautological, so I'd probably remove the word robustly, but I would replace it with highly reliable. It was, as should be clear from the way I've presented things, the chronological sequence of events here, great care was taken not to disclose its significance. He was clearly unaware of the significance when he presented. To reiterate, if he was aware of the significance of these little jerks, when he had his event last year in February, he would have presented already to a doctor.
Then, Doctor, paragraph 36.4, just continue from there, please.
Oh, just to make the other point is that the clustering, end of 36.3, is that this clustering, just to reiterate, is highly typical of epileptic seizures. It's a highly characteristic feature.
When I say that you refer to the clusters, is he's reporting to you at times these myoclonic twitches would happen a few at a time, and then sometimes it's interspersed over a number of days.
Yeah, correct. So it's a curious phenomenon. It's well known. Sometimes people want explanations for this. It's a lengthy, I won't bore you with the details, but the phenomenon of clustering of a few in a day and then nothing for a while, then a few a day is highly characteristic of all the forms of epilepsy.
Right, if you now continue paragraph 36.4, please.
So then, just to reiterate, the generalized interictal epileptic form discharges these spikes, provide, firstly, as I said, 36.4.1, independent, unambiguous verification of the diagnosis of epilepsy, And these discharges on their own have a high specificity for epilepsy. In conjunction with the history, you take two probabilities, you multiply them, each of them highly predictive, and you end up, you can see, with a very near certain diagnosis. And I've commented earlier about the issues of specificity, which is the diagnostic utility or usefulness of a test in excluding false positives. So then if you look at 36.42, these discharges that we've shown earlier on the EEG also provide unambiguous, independent, highly specific evidence that he has a generalized form of epilepsy, which, just to stress, is of the two broad categories of epilepsies, is the less frequent one. So the EEG, again, proves that he has a generalized form of seizure.
If I was saying the more common form of in these two categories would be the focal.
Yes, so focal seizures symptomatic and focal seizures on EEG are more common than the generalized ones.
Then in paragraph 36.4.3, something perhaps you've already touched on, said that there's evidence of a genetically determined form of generalized epilepsy, such as juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. You've just explained before, perhaps just briefly confirm again, the fact that it's referred to as a genetically determined form does not necessarily, as a prerequisite, require other family members to suffer from something.
Correct, yeah. So it alludes to the earlier comments that I made, which is that a multiplicity of genes determines this condition. It's not a single gene, and hence it's not passed vertically in families. When you find family members, sometimes there's a distant family member with it, just reflecting this complex gene inheritance.
Then paragraph 36.4.4.
So as we discussed earlier, the finding of a generalized spike and wave, one of these discharges, which was then time locked precisely to the movement of the one thumb, and bearing in mind we couldn't see the other one, that then proves that not only is there generalized epilepsy, but there is myoclonic generalized epilepsy. Right? And although these discharges are, as you can see, brief, of the order of 350 milliseconds, they're crucial when it comes to the diagnosis of epilepsy. And just to make the point is that if you spontaneously, again to reiterate the point, if you spontaneously moved your thumb, you won't have that discharge on your EEG in response to moving your thumb. It works the other way around. We know who's the chicken and who's the egg here.
And you also make the point, paragraph 36.4.4, if I understand correctly, that unlike the jerk when he was in stage 2 sleep, when the thumb was twitched, he was wide awake.
He was wide awake, and it was so minor that he didn't notice it. And for that reason, you can see that when we work out when someone's let's say juvenile myoclonic epilepsy starts, if they can remember the first one, we in our own minds in the profession would say to ourselves, the seizure started then or before that, because there may be clinically unrecognized ones for all sorts of reasons. So, and perhaps I should just digress here, because it's quite an important point this, is that patients can have minor seizures, which they pass or fob off. They can have minor ones in their sleep, which go unnoticed. They can have major ones in their sleep that nobody knows about. How do I know this? Well, I trawl through records of patients every night in our ward, 5 of them a night, and in trawling through this, I frequently find seizures that not the nurses spot, that not the patients spot. And just to give an example, last week there was a boy in our ward who had a major seizure, tonic-clonic seizure, grand mal seizure. The nurse who was on duty, who was watching, we have him in an open ward, she had left that area. She had gone to attend to another patient. The patient had a major seizure, no warning, generalized seizure, and afterwards he felt okay. When I saw him at the end of the day, he said to me he He had no seizures that day, and when I trawled through his recording, there he had a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. Right? So patients can have even major seizures that neither, if they're on their own, that neither they nor people who subsequently talk to them will be aware of. So when you date the onset of the condition, epilepsy, we simply have to say to ourselves, that's when we can first date it, but it may well have been present before then in sleep or whatever, or even in wakefulness.
I think, Doctor, perhaps just finish 36.4.5, where you draw a distinction between what's called hypnic jerks, which is normal.
Yeah.
That's the jerks that you would sometimes experience when you're busy falling asleep.
Correct, yeah. So we see these, again, on our video EEG recordings, and patients report them and they push the button. And in fact, he had one, I think the one night, if I'm not mistaken, as he was falling asleep.
But that was not a...
That's, if it's during that transition, you can discount it confidently.
Then paragraph 37, if we deal with it, the Canadians ask us, how significant is his version that he lost consciousness without any pre-warning?
Right. So just
I'm talking about the evening of the
yeah. So it goes back to the point about this distinction between focal and generalized epilepsies. So the focal ones, don't forget, are more common. They commonly, not inevitably, but commonly have a warning. And so the lack of a warning is much more strongly predictive of a generalized form of epilepsy than a focal form of epilepsy. So his lack of a warning on the night is highly characteristic of the generalized forms of seizures, and it's less characteristic of the focal forms of seizures.
And by contrast, the focal epilepsy, what do you mean by forewarning or auras, means that it's spending something that's not there.
Correct.
Or tasting something that's not there.
Correct, yeah. So just to reiterate, although they're called auras, they're in fact seizures. They're seizures that start in one part of the brain. They produce a symptom. So if they start in the temporal lobe, you might get deja vu or a smell or funny taste. And if the seizure propagates through the brain and it goes into the, what I call the motor cortex in your frontal lobes, which is the area that controls your movements, then at that point you get movement. So the seizure starts focally, you get a smell or a taste or whatever as your aura. The aura is a seizure, it spreads through the brain, and then you get a big seizure. So his lack of a warning is in favor of a generalized form of epilepsy rather than the one that starts in one part of the brain.
And then in subcategory 37.1, if we continue there, please.
So then, in thinking about the other possibilities on the night for his prolonged period of amnesia, which we'll come to in a moment, but I state there that the absence of the very characteristic prodromal, meaning the warning symptoms of syncope being a loss of consciousness due to a lack of blood flow to the brain. And these symptoms are lightheadedness or dizziness, a blurring or receding vision, with or without sound that appears to get softer, sounds in the environment, and a feeling that patients say of an imminent faint, as they'll put it. And many people will be familiar with this. The absence of that makes it highly unlikely that he had syncope. And hence that a faint was the cause for his loss of consciousness. And to make the point that, as we all know, faints or ordinary syncope, so-called vasovagal syncope, people typically recover very quickly, and many of us have seen people who've had just that. If you have prolonged syncope, as can occur with when your heart stops, then you don't get blood to your brain for a long time, then you're going to damage the brain. So that's the difference between short syncope, and as we know, there's no cell in the body that's as prone to deprivation of oxygen as brain cells.
And then, if I understand it correctly, the symptoms of syncope there would be a pre-warning and dizziness for somebody not lose consciousness.
Indeed, yeah. So I think we can be very confident that he didn't have a syncopal event on that.
Then paragraph 37.2, it's all exploring other possible explanations. Can you continue there, please?
Yeah, so as I indicated earlier when I was taking the history from him, the fact that nobody came down the stairs towards him, that he was not aware or didn't hear anybody following up the stairs, makes it highly unlikely that he was hit over the head and abruptly lost consciousness.
Then, with regards to the cyst that you've seen on the MRI on the fourth ventricle,
yeah,
we'll just deal with that quickly.
Yeah, so the particular cyst that he has is as they say in Afrikaans, to follow. When you scan people, we often find these little cysts in and around the brain. They're like little birthmarks in the brain. They're clinically inconsequential. They don't trouble us in the least, and they're completely unrelated to his symptomatology. There's a different type of cyst which looks completely different on the scan, which can sit there in the back part of the brain. And that can block the flow of so-called cerebrospinal fluid in the back part of your brain. And those, depending on your posture, can abruptly cause you to lose consciousness, fall to the ground. They're extremely rare. I think I've seen one in my entire career. And when they happen, you're up straight afterwards, sometimes with a bit of headache.
Then 37.4.
Yeah, so the condition of cataplexy is similar in as much as people suddenly lose tone in their body, and it's in fact a fragment of REM sleep, and it's a symptom in this condition called narcolepsy. And narcolepsy is a sleep disorder, a REM sleep disorder. And when patients have narcolepsy, some of them, not all of them, get episodes in the day where sometimes in response to emotion, they lose tone in their bodies and they slump to the ground and they recover very quickly. And it's really just an intrusion of REM sleep. Believe it or not, if you're paralyzed in REM sleep, all your muscles are paralyzed except respiration, eye movements, and one of the little ear muscles. But all the other muscles are paralyzed. So if you have micro REM sleep while you're awake, then you slump to the ground and you recover quickly. So that's cataplexy.
Then 37.5.
So he reports that he was perfectly lucid immediately before he lost his memory, and before he became amnestic, while he walked up the stairs. He vividly recalls to phone the emergency services, and he recalls looking up and seeing Henri lying at the top of the stairs with only her right arm and leg moving, corroborating the findings of what I discovered in Dr. Mario Small-Smith's report, that she had a left hemiplegia. And there was paralysis on the left side as a consequence of her brain injury. So what we can safely conclude is that in the moments leading up to his abrupt amnesia or reported amnesia, is that his brain was working perfectly fine.
For this purpose of the record, the report of Dr. Maurice Small-Smith has been handed in as exhibit BB11. Yes, Doctor, please continue 37.6.
Yeah. So then, that's an important point, is when patients lose consciousness, the pattern of memory loss is important. So patients who have epileptic seizures, from the moment that electrical discharge starts in the brain, they don't have what's called retrograde amnesia or memory loss going backwards in time from the moment that the seizure starts, which is different. So his history of an abrupt amnesia without any retrograde component is different to, say, a traumatic brain injury before and have retrograde amnesia. And it's different to what is reported in psychogenic amnesia. And psychogenic amnesia is one where patients have typically very prolonged retrograde amnesia. They walk around in a fugue-like state usually. So they don't fall to the ground, they just lose their memory. So, and then the pattern of what's called the gradient of memory loss with a traumatic brain injury, the memory going backwards in time has a gradient, severe for the most recent memories and better for more remote memories in the past. In psychogenic in amnesia, you have the opposite pattern. So you have retrograde amnesia, but it's more severe for more remote and better the recent one. So it's what's called inverted or it's flat.
Right. And then, in summary, paragraph 37.8, could you just put that on record, please?
Yeah, I thought actually, I wanted to, at this point, just raise another issue which occurred to me in subsequent to compilation of this report. And it's an obvious question which I hadn't explicitly considered in compiling this report, but it occurred to me. And the scientific questions, I've described to you the patterns of memory loss in these different conditions. Because in my practice, it's very rare to see people with malingering in private practice. I see some of them, I've seen more of them at Tygerberg Hospital, of people wanting disability grants, etc., where there's secondary gain. But I asked myself the question, subsequent to the compilation of this report, is what is the scientific evidence about the pattern of memory loss in malingering? So in order to address this question, I did the standard evidence-based approach to this, evidence-based medicine approach to this, which is I went to the National Library of Medicine, called PubMed, and you can do this for yourself if you like. So just to explain to you, the National Library of Medicine is the repository of all biomedical journals dating back to 1966 and prior to that sort of more patchy representation of journal articles. So, but everything going back to 1966, all the biomedical literature published in the world, English and all sorts of foreign languages, is in there. And it's an extremely useful database. So that's what I did was take a standard evidence-based approach to this, and I typed in simply two search terms, which was malingering and amnesia, and Boolean connector, which is and in capital letters. And you can do this for yourself. And there were 95 articles that came up. I have read all the abstracts, and the most important, the most relevant articles that pertain to this issue of malingering and amnesia and the patterns that are evident. I went through those articles, and to summarize the findings is that all of the literature on the subject that I could find, and I went through some of the references as well, describes amnesia. The reports are in the forensic psychiatry literature and the forensic literature, and the pattern of amnesia is a consistent one, and all of them describe amnesia for the murder or the homicide. So I could find not a single article which describes amnesia for a post-homicide, post-event. And so that must be an important issue in the differential diagnosis.
That's not the only thing. The amnesia, an incident, so this is a crime, it's a continuing offense, doesn't have a beginning or an end.
Sure.
If an offender is called upon to explain the crime, he explains it throughout, and part of it will be what happens afterwards, to give an exculpatory version.
Yeah, but
You see, in my experience as a bench, I can only tell you that. I haven't looked at the medical literature. That in almost every case where offender can't explain his conduct, he explains it with amnesia.
Correct.
And that your literature research as well.
Yes, but
to draw a distinction between post and pre-offence, it's an artificial distinction, isn't it?
No,
in the realm of real experience.
Well, all I can speak from no experience, but simply having done a systematic, scientifically validated way of searching the Library of Medicine.
You've heard scientifically validated a lot in this court.
But the literature is very clear. I'm happy to submit the articles to this court. The literature refers to it as a read out, and so the loss of memory is for the homicide. That's the way it's described in the literature, and not.
Yes, but you're drawing a distinction between loss of memory during the commission of an offence and the post-offence period.
Correct, correct.
And you are saying that you rarely find such a situation.
I couldn't find a single report of it.
But what I'm putting to you is that you're quite right. It's probably difficult to find such a reference, but the real problem is that the distinction is artificial.
Well, I think the literature is clear. They call it a red out, and that the offenders consistently describe amnesia for the murder or the homicide. That's the pattern of description, and it's called a red out. And I think, I think there's a reason why it's called a red out.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Butler. Please, can I interrupt you?
Sorry,
I hope I didn't interrupt your plane of thought.
No. Dr. Butler, if I understand the last bit correctly, what you found on your research is that people, when they tend to lie, they tend to, about whether they have amnesia or not, they tend to link the amnesia, the period of amnesia, to the commission of whatever offence they charge with, not with the period thereafter.
Correct.
Because obviously there's very little to gain from that.
Yes, undoubtedly. And the red out is because there's blood around and they have no memory for the bloodshedding that happened.
Yes.
So hence it's called a red out. I could find, so they're amnesic for, and the other point that seems to emerge is this sort of symmetry of memory loss anchored around the point at which the homicide is committed.
Yes.
So obviously what's different in this instance is the events around the homicide are recalled. The amnesia is subsequent to it.
So the only point you're making is this is what makes this different from what you found in your research is that the period of amnesia seems to be in this instance after the event of the.
Yes, and I could find no precedent, just to make it abundantly clear, I can find no precedent for that in the literature.
Right, if you can continue then. You said that in summary, an epileptic seizure represents the only plausible neurological explanation for the abrupt onset of amnesia, but there are pre-monitoring symptoms.
Yeah, and I think I'm strongly moved to remove, with those comments in mind, to remove the word neurological.
So what do you want to do? Exclude the word neurological?
Yes.
Neurological.
Then, Doctor, we continue.
What are you saying in paragraph 37.8? Just repeat what you're saying in paragraph 37.8.
Well, good question. So, having thought through all of the possibilities, and so, I think I should be clear in my job, and I spend my life thinking about periods of loss of consciousness, is that in all of the possible causes that exist on the planet for loss of consciousness for a period of, be it minutes or hours, or even seconds, the evidence that we have available, scientific evidence, makes unlikely that the other discounts the other possibilities, and the only man left standing, as it were, is an epileptic seizure.
Now, Doctor, perhaps I was planning on getting to this a bit later on, but perhaps it's an appropriate time to ask you this at this stage. You were obviously aware of the evidence that was presented by Dr. Dutrevaux,
yes,
the neurosurgeon that was called by the defence.
Yes.
Did you happen to view were you not in court? Were you watching it on television?
No, I've only seen his, his documents that he submitted to court and what I've read in the media. Advocate Galloway will know about my views about his testimony.
Well, I will invite you to place it on record, please.
So, as I've indicated in my pre-existing testimony here, I can't explain his loss of consciousness on the basis of syncope, because the symptomatology doesn't fit. There's no prodrome. The period of amnesia is prolonged. And syncope just cannot explain that. And for the same reason, traumatic brain injury cannot explain 2 hours and 40 minutes loss of consciousness, or highly unlikely, because nobody followed him up the stairs, nobody came down towards him, so why on earth would he suddenly become amnestic for that period.
If I understand you correctly, the immediate onset of the amnesia, the abrupt onset thereof, is highly significant.
Yes, indeed.
Sorry, I missed you there, Mr. Worth. What was that question?
So the abruptness of onset of the amnesia is highly significant as much as the only culprit left standing is an epileptic seizure.
If one accepts the factual correctness of the fact that there was amnesia.
Yes. We're coming to the rest of it later.
Right. Now, paragraph 38, we continue on that, please.
So then he reports that he awoke in exactly the same place where he fell, where he became amnestic.
Yes.
And he awoke lying face down. So the corroborative evidence that I think has been presented before this court suggests that this period was about 2 hours and 40 minutes. And certainly his history that he gave me is consistent with that, in as much as before he became amnestic, it was dark, and when he regained his memory, it was light.
Yeah. And you explore the possible causes for this, the top of paragraph page 15, please.
So, so the 38.1, so to reiterate, psychogenic amnesia as a cause for the described period of amnesia can effectively be excluded because, firstly, such patients remain erect, they walk around, they're in what's called a fugue state, they don't fall over, they just can't remember, they're awake, they're able to talk, and they may wander about. And then, secondly, the amnesia in psychogenic amnesia is typically retrograde, and it has either a flat or an inverted pattern. So that clearly is not consistent with the history that is provided here. So we can exclude psychogenic amnesia as a cause for that. Then the other possibility that I mentioned to you earlier, which is that he had psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, which, to stress, is part of the conversion disorders where the brain automatically converts emotionally traumatic events into seizures. They can sometimes report long periods of amnesia, but I have yet to see anybody in reviewing hundreds of patients who has remained lying in the same position following a psychogenic seizure, non-epileptic seizure.
Is there any evidence? Is there any literature that supports the conclusion that you can have an epileptic seizure that results in amnesia for 2 hours, 40 minutes?
Much longer. Yeah, so I'm coming to that later. So then the 38.3, to reiterate, syncope or loss of consciousness due to impaired blood flow to the brain appears, I think one can safely exclude that because it can't alone explain his loss of that period of amnesia. If you deprive the brain of oxygen for more than a few minutes, you effectively get neuronal damage and subsequently brain death. 38.4, so as I said earlier, a traumatic brain injury, as we know, can cause periods of amnesia and loss of consciousness for varying periods from, what we call concussions, which are brain injuries, to many weeks, and sometimes months, rarely months. Perhaps at this point one should draw the distinction, just to make clear, because it's clear in my mind, but it's obviously not widely understood by lay people, hardly understood, is the distinction between loss of consciousness and amnesia is an important one. So amnesia refers to your loss of memory. And the systems that mediate memory are located in the inside of your temporal lobes on each side. So we've got two of them, just like you've got two kidneys, you've got two of them in the temporal lobes. They're called the hippocampi, and that's what we use for short-term memory.
So what do you say in this case? Was there loss of amnesia or loss of
Well,
memory?
I'm coming to that. So I want to just set the stage for that.
Yes.
So, and that's why I just want to draw the distinction. So, problem just in your hippocampi, then you lose your memory, but you're still awake and able to talk and walk around. That's amnesia. That is different to the process in the brain where you are awake and you're awake and looking about and aroused and awake. And that system in the brain, the anatomical system and the physiological system that subserves that, runs from the brain stem, and it's a fan of fibers that fans out in both hemispheres. So if you disturb function in one part of the brain, let's say where my little finger is, then that is inadequate to depress your level of consciousness. You'll still be awake and you'll still be able to look around. So the point being is that if you have a problem just in your hippocampus and the rest of your brain is functioning fine, you can have amnesia but still be conscious. And so, for instance, if you have a seizure just in your temporal lobes, you can have nothing more than amnesia. And I see patients like this, they're dragged in by their spouse because they're getting these short periods of memory loss for 30 seconds. Because they've got memory loss, they don't realize they've lost their memory. Right? So they argue, they sit in front of the spouses argue because the one says there's nothing wrong with me, and the other one says, well, you keep losing your memory for these 30 seconds. So that, and there's another condition called transient global amnesia, which lasts hours, where there's a migraine-like disturbance in your hippocampus, right? And you're awake, you're talking and you're conversing with people, and you repeat questions because you can't remember. But all you have is a memory loss. You're perfectly conscious. Whereas if you have a disturbance of brain function throughout the brain, then you lose consciousness. If you lose consciousness, so if you have a disturbance of the entire brain's function, then an obligatory part of that is a loss of memory. So you can have a dissociation between amnesia and loss of consciousness. You can have amnesia without loss of consciousness, but if you've got loss of consciousness, you lose your memory, because the whole brain's not working. So, okay. Where were we?
The question is, Doctor, in this instance where the accused is reported.
Oh, yes, so he's lying.
That's been for 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
So, for purposes, we'll get to that later in your report, why you say that. If this was a grand mal seizure that he experienced, let's start there first of all. His Lordship has asked you, could a grand mal seizure last for as long as 2 hours and 40 minutes?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. So most seizures last 2 or 3 minutes. Some of them last longer, and some of them, anything that lasts longer than half an hour is called status epilepticus. So the condition of status epilepticus is a seizure that lasts longer than half an hour. We see them in the ward. Especially people who aren't on medication are prone to long seizures. So that's called status epilepticus. So to answer the question, can you have long seizures? Yes, they do happen. However, without the benefit of someone observing the seizure, what is impossible to say in retrospect is if you have 2 hours and 40 minutes of amnesia, but he's been lying in the same place, you can infer that firstly lying in the same place means that his level of consciousness is depressed. He's not moving. The parts of the brain that help you move and get up and wander about, they're not working. So that's why you're lying there for 2 hours, 40 minutes. So he hasn't just simply got amnesia. He's got the whole brain's not working. So to answer your question, you can have a seizure which lasts 2 minutes, and then afterwards, and we'll come to this in a moment, you have what's called the postictal state. So immediately at the end of the seizure, grand mal seizure, the brain's electrical activity is flat. So it looks like someone who is brain dead, right? But it's only for a temporary period, and the brain cells then start to recover. But the postictal period can go on, and people can be in this state for hours after a seizure. So 2 hours, 40 minutes might be a 3-minute seizure and a postictal brain where the brain's activity is initially flat and then extremely slow, and you lie there and you're not moving. So either of those are possible to account for 2 hours, 40 minutes. And it's impossible to say which it was. He could have had a seizure for half an hour, and he had 2 hours and 10 minutes of postictal state. And we'll show you some
Postictal.
Yeah, so
What does that mean?
so post means after,
Yes.
and ictus means the seizure. So the post-ictal state is a period which typically lasts hours and sometimes days. And during that time, the brain does not work properly, and the EEG is markedly abnormal.
Now, perhaps you can just ask this outright. In the clinic, I understand in your clinic where you be working observing patients that experience seizures. Can you perhaps elaborate? Have you seen this before?
We see this weekly. We see this weekly. Yeah.
In other words, where persons experience a grand mal seizure,
Yeah.
would lie prone for hours.
Yeah. And I mean, this weekend I had somebody lay there for a day.
Without any movement on.
Well, with minimal movement.
Minimal.
Yeah. So the point is 2 hours and 40 minutes doesn't mean absolutely no movement. It means all you can conclude is if he wakes up in the same place is that there's been either no movement or very little movement.
But again, the difference in, first of all, let's call it intensity or severity of the seizure from a mere twitch, as we see the thumb of the twitch, to somebody who lies prone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Is that rare? The variation.
One of the most common questions that patients ask me is why do I, and I was asked this weekend, and it's practically every consultation has dealt with the issue, why are some of my seizures mild, some of them severe, some of them short, and some of them long. And the international the researchers in developing criteria for seizure diaries and seizure severity, something called the Liverpool Seizure Severity Scale. And so it allows every patient to categorize seizures into different severities, right? And the reason the scale exists is because there's this marked variation in individuals' severity and duration of seizures. So some seizures might be 3 minutes, and the next time they might have an episode of status epilepticus where the seizure goes on for hours. And as I say, every consultation practically involves dealing with why this variability in duration and severity.
After 65 days, this is my first. Now, just switch it off, please.
Please. And put mine off as well. These things have to be based.
Not a really good day for me and my client. First he comes live later and then my mobile phone goes. I apologize.
No problems.
Yes, sorry doctor.
This variation in the duration of seasons is almost a universal phenomenon.
Then in paragraph 38.5, talk about another possibility that you considered.
Yeah, as part of syncope, and we see this occasionally, where the heart either goes extremely slow or stops for a period. And then you also get faint, you have the syncope, so you black out. You usually get prodromal symptoms, so the absence of prodromal symptoms here is significant. And again, to make the point is, those are uncommon, they're almost unheard of, not unheard of, but they're more frequent in the elderly. And if you deprive the brain of oxygen for more than a few minutes, well, you have sequelae that are enduring.
And conclude, say in paragraph 38.6, that you couldn't find no other medical cause for lying prone or virtually prone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Then if you get 38.7, please continue then.
Yeah, so if you don't move for 2 hours and 40 minutes, then you can see, as I said to you, the whole brain is not working. You can't remember, you can't move. So the fact that you can't move and you can't remember must mean the whole brain is not working.
Then 38.8.
And I did add there, I mean, it's possible that that symptom on its own, of course, you could malinger that.
Yes.
So 38.8 is, as I've said, this duration of lying after either some part of it consumed by the seizure and some of it by the so-called postictal state. To remind you, post being after the seizure, where the brain's waves are initially flat on EEG and then slow. That period it's commonplace for us to see prolonged periods of lying in bed there in a so-called unconscious state. And immobile, often people lie there and snore and not snore, but snort. So the muscles are all up and limbs are lying making that kind of noise.
Then in 38.9, you indicated none of the other diagnostics.
The way you make your face now, that's how I imagine seizures do.
I mean, I'm suffering from seizures every single time. I've been told. Paragraph 38.9 said none of the other diagnostic possibilities other than malingering can explain the support of lying in the same place for when it was dark until when it was likely for 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, I moved to exclude the possibility of malingering for other reasons, which I'll enunciate later. But this issue of the striking period of his amnesia being not a red out around the time of the homicide, but subsequent to it, I think is significant given the scientific evidence that was available.
We'll return to that issue about the other possibility about malingering later on in the course. Yes. Then paragraph 39, you're still dealing with the different aspects that you...
The basis for my conclusion that there's compelling evidence that he had a seizure on the night of the homicide. Yeah.
Now we get to him having lost control of his bladder.
Yeah. So I think and I want to just go back to the history here. So I want to go back to the history here, which when I obtained this history about the recent event, and then asked him about the events that happened on that night. He hadn't had incontinence after the recent ones, he didn't report it. And then in asking him about and this is before he knew his diagnosis, asking him about the incontinence, or asking about the wet pants, his answer to me initially was no. And as an afterthought, he said to me, well, he was told that he wet his pants. And what was abundantly clear to me then was that he, seeming like everybody else who's been involved in the matter, was oblivious to the profound neurological significance of the incontinence.
Doctor, wetting of pants is a common occurrence, especially in traumatic incidents. You see it in murders, you see victims, in assailants, you see it on torture victims. I've seen torture victims wetting themselves. Even before they are tortured, when they see the torturer, they wet their pants.
Sure.
And we've seen it in this very courtroom, evidence of that. And we've seen wetting of pants with people about to die. They wet their pants as well. So wetting of pants is a very common occurrence, and very few people admit that the pants are wet because it's a display of cowardice or whatever impression they may have of themselves for wetting their pants in a moment of strife. So does that take the case any further, the wetting of pants?
Well, I think it takes it substantially further, and
Okay.
the scientific evidence, and this is not an opinion, I'm going to give you the scientific evidence for this. So the first point is that if you tell any medical student or any doctor that someone lost consciousness for a period, nobody witnessed it, and subsequently they found to have wet pants, then the diagnosis of epilepsy will be right up in the probabilities will be extremely high. Okay, that's the first point. And I'm going to come to some of the other issues in a moment. The second is that, and I've quoted the reference at the end of this study, but this has in fact been looked at in patients when they present with loss of consciousness in a systematic way, both in history taking, but also in hospital when patients have video EEG recordings. And so the co-occurrence of a period of loss of consciousness followed by incontinence of urine is very strongly predictive of the presence of epilepsy. 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 Of a grand mal, tonic-clonic, or epileptic seizure.
Oh, I see, okay.
So it's very strongly predictive. And so the likelihood, if you have a faint and you wet yourself, well, that's possible. But if there's anything more than a few seconds of or prolonged period of loss of consciousness with associated loss of consciousness, I think any doctor is going to tell you that the patient highly likely has had an epileptic seizure. I'll come to some of the other aspects at the moment related to the loss of consciousness. But as you'll see, and at the end of my my report on page 24, in epilepsy, where in November this, this was, I think, no, that's the wrong one, I beg your pardon. Just find the study in question. So on page 23, in epilepsy in 2008, so you'll see there's a study of patients who in hospital who have video EEG recordings, so that the nurses, and on video you can observe whether patients bite their tongues and whether they wet themselves. And without taking you through this, I can provide the court with the original article, but this is a very important seminal article in this respect. But you can see the conclusions. You simply need to read the conclusions, which is, despite frequent reports of oral lacerations and incontinence by patients with psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, objective evidence for this is highly specific for convulsive epileptic seizures. So in this instance, we have what they had, which is we have verified evidence of incontinence of urine.
Doctor, you were made copies of what is the purpose of as exhibit D1. It's photographs 182 and 183.
Yeah, that's right.
Although that is before court. Part of Captain Hubert's report. Those were the photographs taken of the sleeping trunks that
yes,
the accused was wearing at the time, indicating the urine stain.
Yes, yeah. Sure. So if you have any person who has a period of loss of consciousness unobserved and subsequently found to have their pants that look like this in hospital, or your neighbour, I would suggest you take them to a neurologist, because there's a high chance they've had an epileptic seizure.
That would exclude the possibility of the urination taking place for the...
I'm coming to that. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, I'd like to deal with that. Yeah.
Will you also give me an indication of what those ones want to...
You want a journal?
Perhaps I should just deal with this one when you finish with the rules.
I think there's an issue allied to that, which I think would be useful.
So you can talk about that tomorrow. Let's just follow what Mr. Booth has to say.
Could we perhaps just try and be able to finish within the next 20 minutes or so with this aspect of the incontinence?
Yes.
Yes.
Are you available tomorrow, Doctor?
Yes, I'll be here. So then So that was, we dealt with, in paragraph 40, when I was reading this last night, I thought that on review, I would, you'll see there that the fifth line, I say there, the incontinence of urine obligatorily indicates that something happened in his brain. It's not due to malingering. I think as an evidence-based person, I would probably rephrase that with the words highly likely. I don't like the use of so under paragraph 40, the incontinence of urine obligatorily indicates that something happened in his brain. So I'd replace that word with highly likely indicates. You with me on?
Yes.
Yeah.
You wanted the word obligatory deleted and replaced with highly likely.
Highly likely, yes.
Yes, thank you.
So, you know, in my training, and it's still trotted out today, if someone has incontinence of urine, the statement in neurology is it's of neurogenic origin until proven otherwise. And let alone in the face of someone who loses consciousness. As I've shown you, the scientific evidence is strongly predictive. When you have loss of consciousness and incontinence, it's strongly predictive of the presence of epileptic seizures.
Then in paragraph 41.
Yeah. So allied to that issue is the issue of what is very clear is that he was unaware of the fact that his pants were wet. And I think this is a crucial aspect of the evidence here in respect of the fact that he had a seizure on that night. And I want to explain to you why that is the case. So, if your neurological systems are intact and you get information from wherever it is in the body to your brain, then you normally would be aware of paralysis or wet pants. There's a condition called neurological called neglect, where when the brain's not working perfectly, so you're awake, but the processing of sensory information in the brain, the higher order processing of sensory information is impaired, then you neglect this information. You're not aware of it. So, for instance, if patients get a big stroke, or it's not necessarily that big a stroke in the right side of their brain, in the part of the brain that subserves awareness of the other side of the body, you can be paralyzed and blissfully unaware of the fact that you have paralysis. It's called neglect. It's well known to neurologists. And if there's something wrong with your brain, on both sides, the whole brain is not working well, you can wet your pants and be blissfully unaware of the fact that you have it. So we see this in the ward, post-ictally with patients. They lie there, their pants are wet. After a seizure, the nurses change their pants. I come and do my ward round at the end of the day and I say to them, have you had a seizure or not? And they say no. And the nurses say to me, doctor, the pants were wet, or the person...
This situation, we have the case where the accused mother, father, brother were killed. He's lived through that. He's lived through a trauma of that.
Yeah.
Wakes up a few hours later. Wetting the pants is the least significant of events to follow up on.
Well,
He's so traumatized. It must have been whatever happened, whatever version one uses is traumatized.
Undoubtedly.
So wetting of the pants is either it's an insignificant consequence of the shocking nature of the events that occurred that night. With all due respect, Your Honour, I'm struck by the magnitude of the wetting of the pants. His recall of... The magnitude of the wetting.
Yes, so
I really spent too much.
No, I know. I mean, this is, that's not, those are not pants that are slightly wet, as the Afrikaans people say. It's not a flipsy.
Yeah, but that's it's just the front portion of the pants.
Yeah, but I think...
That's a large version of the pants.
Indeed, yeah. But I think one can infer that, the inside here. So the point is that the sensory systems being intact in Mr. van Breda, the information that we've got to his brain, even if he's emotionally traumatized. And he remembers other things like smoking and sitting there, etc. But he's blissfully unaware of his pants being like this.
But in the scheme of things, as a doctor, would you say that's important?
I think it's very important. And I would suggest that if you put this question to colleagues here and overseas, they would come to the same conclusion, that this is a form of neglect. We see it in patients with advanced dementias. We see it in patients who have so-called delirium, where they're awake and looking around, and the brain waves actually look like the post-ictal state. So the brain waves are slow. They have neglect of the fact that their pants are wet. So we see this commonly in neurology.
Perhaps on this aspect, on the post-ictal brain activity, could I perhaps ask you that in the report, we can just briefly refer to it, we'll come back to it again, but if I can ask you to go to Exhibit G, paragraph page 43, which is again one of the slides. Page 43, 44 and 45. 46. Perhaps just take us through that.
Yeah, so it's to illustrate so that page that you have there is a normal EG. So that's in fact taken from Mr. van Breda. And as I said earlier, those are just normal brain rhythms. Could you advance that? So this is the EG of someone. This is a different person because we didn't record a generalized tonic-clonic or grand mal seizure from Mr. van Breda, but this is towards the end of a grand mal or generalized tonic-clonic seizure. The next slide shows you the end of it. So you'll see after the seizure ends about the second or third second of this 10-second page, and you'll see then after that the brain's electrical activity is completely flat, and that period of what's called suppression of normal activity, which to reiterate looks like the EG of someone who's got cortical death, brain death. The EG is flat at that point, and that duration of that period can vary from one person to the next.
And then we get the next slide. Page 45 of the Exhibit G.
So this is the post-ictal period. So there's a gradual transition from this flat EG as the person recovers to very slow waves. And that looks markedly different to the EG that I showed you of a normal EG. The brain waves there are very, very slow, and at this point the brain is not, to put it simply, is not working properly. It's very dysfunctional.
3 hours post-ictal.
So is this one, I'm not sure, yes, this one is taken from a patient 3 hours post-ictal, and it could be an hour post-ictal. It varies from one person to the next.
And then the next one, page 46, different patient, 44 hours after a single seizure.
Yeah, so just to make the point about the duration, I alluded to this earlier, is the post-ictal period, when the brain is not working perfectly, varies from one seizure to the next and from one person to the next. And so this is an example of someone I had in the ward in the last few weeks who she has epilepsy. She was without seizures for a long while, and then she had a seizure. We admitted her, and the reason we admitted her was that she had a post-ictal state where she just wasn't right. She wasn't herself. She was awake. She was talking, and I saw her. And on the first day, she was talking. She didn't realize anything was wrong with her whatsoever. She, in fact, thought there was nothing wrong with her. The family thought she wasn't quite herself. And by the following day, I could still see she wasn't quite herself. And you'll see the EG starting to improve. But you'll see between there are these periods of still, from the second to the fourth second of this recording, and then the last few seconds. The EG there is still intermittently very slow. So she was awake, she was talking, she knew the day of the week, she knew the month, so she was lucid and orientated and talking, but when I assessed her neurologically, her higher order cognitive function was impaired. And that was correlated with what we saw on the EEG. So the point being is that this postictal period goes on for hours and sometimes days, and occasionally even a week or two.
Dr. Lord, perhaps it'll be a convenient time to take the adjournment. If I can ask you to arrive tomorrow to come in. You had, in this place of legal record, you had access and you listened to the emergency calls that was made by Mr. Van der Gaal that morning. And I specifically want you to comment on that.
Well, I think, you can correct me if my conclusions are incorrect, but I'm sure, I'm as qualified as you are to make judgments about that. But I personally was struck by two things. One was his lack of urgency, and secondly, his lack of effectiveness in getting things, in orchestrating events to attend to his clearly dire situation, or the dire situation of his family.
Now that lack of urgency and the lack of purposeful actions in the part, would that be consistent with somebody that is in the postictal state?
All patients who have postictal state whose EEGs look like that are slow, they look dulled, they're ineffective, they lack urgency, they're cognitively, soos hulle sê, nie reg in die kop nie.
Would this be the winning time?
Yeah, thank you. Go to the journal to 10 tomorrow.
Ai, bem. Lo que nos está haciendo es de guardar un mata. Y además, las mujeres la que no.
Nie ma zraku śledziku.